Snow fell in slow, steady sheets across the high ground of the Ardennes on the 16th of December, 1944. In the twilight before dawn, German columns rolled west on forest roads, engines muffled orders, brief ambition, large. American infantry divisions held a sector long considered quiet, posted along ridgelines and villages whose names would soon fill dispatches: Elsenborn Ridge, Saint-Vith, Bastogne, Echternach. The problem was concrete and immediate. Winter swallowed sound. Fog pinned aircraft to their airfields. Shells fitted with contact fuses buried themselves deep in soft ground, and snow smothering their fragments. Time fuses fought the trees and the wind. The defense needed a way to put steel reliably into the air at the height of a marching man. That solution had traveled a long road from laboratory benches to ammunition dumps. A proximity fuse, a compact radio set engineered to survive gun launch and to detonate a shell when it sensed a target nearby. It was in essence a method of turning a near miss into a burst at precisely the deadly distance. In December 1944, limited stocks reached field artillery units on the Western Front under strict control. The timing coincided with the last great German offensive in the West. When battalions formed in the woods, when companies shook out along snowbound lanes, when assault waves closed the final 100 meters, the choice of fuse would decide whether fragments struck air or earth. This film asks a narrow, testable question. How did proximity fuses change the outcome of infantry attacks during the Battle of the Bulge, and why did they matter at Elsenborn Ridge around Bastogne and along the Sauer River near Echternach? The answer lies in doctrine and logistics as much as electronics. It begins here in a forest where the sky is low, the snow is deep, and artillery must find a way to burst above men instead of beneath their feet. British air defense in 1939 faced a problem of geometry and time. Fast aircraft made exact time settings unreliable. Contact detonations wasted explosive force in empty air. Scientists in the United Kingdom explored radio and optical schemes to sense a target and burst near it. In 1940, that work reached the United States through the exchange of technical missions. American leaders formed the National Defense Research Committee and then the Office of Scientific Research and Development to absorb, fund, and direct urgent research. Vannevar Bush coordinated laboratories, the services, and industry under a simple mandate: deliver practical results. Do it fast. At Johns Hopkins University, a compact group called Section T pursued a proximity fuse design that could survive gun launch. The physics was straightforward. The engineering was punishing. A shell leaves the bore under extreme acceleration. It spins at thousands of revolutions per minute. Vibration and setback forces destroy fragile circuits and glass vacuum tubes. The team solved the problem step by step. They potted components in shock-absorbing compounds. They designed rugged miniature tubes with thick filaments. They added a reserve power source that activated after firing so that batteries did not leak away on the shelf. They tuned an oscillator to radiate and a detector to read its own echo off a nearby target. A thyrotron switch triggered the detonator when the return crossed a threshold. Every part had to work after the longest possible logistic chain and the roughest handling. The first domain was the sea. Warships needed a better way to defend against dive bombers and low torpedo runs. Naval trials in 1942 over Chesapeake Bay used radio-controlled drones as targets. 5-inch anti-aircraft guns with the new fuse produced kills quickly. The economy of fire convinced the United States Navy to order the fuse in quantity. Production lines multiplied across several manufacturers. Technicians learned to seal the fragile assemblies and to test every unit. By late 1943, fleets in the Pacific were using proximity fuses widely. The improvement over time fuses was large in practice because missed distance no longer doomed a round to uselessness. Near the end of 1944, the same physics would serve on land. Policy shaped the schedule for Europe. Leaders feared that a dud on land could be recovered by German engineers. If the enemy learned the circuit and the tuning, they might counter it or copy it. As a result, a strict ban limited the fuse to sea and to select anti-aircraft roles in theaters where recovery by the enemy was unlikely. The ban began to loosen only after two conditions changed. First, stocks reached a scale that allowed limited risk. Second, the ground situation in Western Europe turned urgent with the onset of winter and the expectation of a German effort. Authorizations flowed in a narrow channel. Field artillery units would receive limited lots. Custody would be tight. Fired rounds must fall within friendly zones or deep behind enemy lines. No unexploded fuse was to remain in ground where the enemy might collect it. American doctrine prepared the ground for a technology leap. Field artillery in the United States Army fought as a network. Fire direction centers pooled guns across battalions. Radios and wire-linked observers to batteries and to higher echelons. When an infantry company called for help, a corps could mass multiple battalions onto a small box within minutes. Snow and forest complicated this method in December 1944. Contact fuses drove fragments into the ground. Time fuses required precise setting and suffered in variable tree height and wind. The proximity fuse promised constant burst height at soldier scale without perfect knowledge of canopy or slope. The build-up to the Ardennes campaign set these lines on a collision course. German planners gathered armor and infantry under Army Group B for a winter offensive aimed at the Meuse and Antwerp. Surprise and bad weather would deny Allied air power. The weight of the first blow would fall on thin infantry divisions and on artillery. On the American side, ammunition stocks and fuel were adequate, but not unlimited. Road conditions were poor. The forest cut observation lines. In this environment, a shell that could place its fragments consistently above advancing men offered a concrete advantage. Distribution began in the last weeks of 1944. First Army and Third Army received initial allocations. Ammunition depots issued wooden crates with special markings. Battery officers briefed crews on handling and on the rules for use. Reserve stocks went to corps artillery groups that could switch support by radio from one division sector to another. Observers learned when to request the new fuse. They asked for it against columns on roads. They asked for it against troops forming in woods. They asked for it in the last 100 meters of an assault, when defenders needed fragments to sweep trenches and snow positions. The technology had limits that commanders had to respect. The fuse worked best against targets with some reflective surface or density. It did not multiply the explosive weight of the shell. It placed that weight at a more lethal point in space. Weather did not defeat it because the sensing was local to the shell. Snow did not absorb it because the burst happened above the drift. The main counter was dispersion and deep cover. German infantry already used both, but assault tactics required closing distances and forming waves at choke points. Roads in forest and villages forced that shape. Industrial and logistic preparation underwrote every tactical effect. By December 1944, the program had produced millions of units across several marks. Quality control rejected large fractions to prevent duds. Supply officers planned rail and truckloads that kept fuses and shells moving to forward depots, even as roads iced and columns tangled. Artillery schools had already built short training pamphlets with diagrams of the fuse train and simple rules for when to use it. The result was not a miracle weapon. It was a well-made tool placed into a doctrine that could exploit it within days. The last ingredient was secrecy on the battlefield. Commanders directed that proximity fuses be fired where recovery by the enemy was least likely. Many batteries used them for concentrations behind enemy forward lines. Others used them just over their own trenches where fragments and speed made recovery impossible. Officers inspected craters and burst patterns to confirm performance and to adjust aiming points for the next shoot. Reports flowed up chains of command within hours. The language was consistent. Air burst over snow stopped men. Air burst over tree lines shredded assembly areas. Air burst on road columns forced immediate cover and halted attacks. By the eve of the offensive, the causes and the buildup converged. Years of laboratory work had produced a fuse that could survive the gun. Naval combat had proven the concept at scale. Policy had guarded the secret until the ground war demanded it. Doctrine and logistics had positioned units to exploit it. When Winter and Surprise handed the initiative to the German side, American artillery possessed a way to put steel at the right height over an assault in bad conditions. The story that follows is the test of that preparation under the pressure of real attacks and real decisions. Dawn on 16th. December 1944 broke as a gray wall over the Ardennes. At 0530 hours, German artillery opened across a wide front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. Infantry and armor of Army Group B pushed into snow-packed valleys and along forest roads. 6th Panzer Army struck toward Malmedy and the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath. 5th Panzer Army pressed west toward Saint-Vith and then Bastogne. 7th Army moved on Luxembourg to protect the southern flank and create pressure along the Sauer River. American outposts reported movement, and cut wire lines were found in the dark. Radio nets carried first contact reports to regimental and division command posts. The first day belonged to the attacker. Weather held Allied aircraft on the ground. Visibility varied by ridge and valley. Infantry held strongpoints and fell back when overrun, calling for artillery to rake roads and assembly areas. American artillery on this sector was organized to mass fire. Batteries of 105mm howitzers sat close behind infantry regiments. 155mm guns and heavier pieces stood deeper. Fire direction centers pooled guns and shifted missions fast. The plan for quiet months used contact and time fuses as standard. Contact fuses drove fragments into frozen earth or deep snow. Time fuses needed accurate settings, and even then tree height and wind produced inconsistent airbursts. Battery officers had in the last weeks briefed crews on a limited new option. Crates marked for special custody held proximity fuses. The order for their use was strict. Fire them only when the shell will burst in areas where German recovery is not possible. Do not leave a dud to be studied. On the northern shoulder, the villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath anchored a hinge in front of Elsenborn Ridge. On 16 and 17th of December, repeated German infantry attacks pushed into the villages and fought house to house. American infantry and engineers held streets and crossroads while artillery fired concentrations on approach routes and along the tree lines. The first calls for proximity fuses came from observers who could see that contact bursts were sinking in the snow. When the new fuses were used, shell bursts crowned above the lanes, where squads had to cross fences and ditches. Fragment spray reached over low walls and into shallow foxholes. The result noted in after-action journals was immediate. Assault groups went to ground or pulled back to regroup. When armor attempted to advance without close infantry anti-tank guns and bazookas waited, the ridge behind the villages offered stable positions for guns and a clear field of fire for airburst. Northwest along the line toward Monschau forest tracks forced German battalions to file into narrow formations. Observers adjusted fire by sound and by the flashes they could glimpse through trees. Tree burst had always been feared in woods, but winter could mute it if shells buried. Proximity fuses removed that mute. An observer who asked for airburst did not have to guess tree height along the entire sheaf. The fuse set its own moment, so that each shell expanded a crown of fragments above the ground path. Dispatches to corps artillery described an effect described as clearing lanes. It meant that short belts of road became untenable under fire for minutes at a time, enough to break an attack cycle that depended on pressure and tempo. At Saint-Vith, the road net drew both sides into a contest for time. German armored columns needed to cross the town and fan out west. American divisions needed to delay and hold corridors long enough for reserves to arrive. On 17 and 18th of December, artillery missions multiplied. Time on target shoots where shells from different batteries arrived together tried to catch columns at crossroads. The new fuse's value here was predictable height of burst over vehicles and marching men. It did not add explosive weight. It placed fragments where roofs and open cargo beds offered reflection for the radio sensor, and where crews were exposed while trying to clear obstacles. Reports from liaison planes were rare under the weather, so ground observers used short corrections and fired for effect as soon as brackets were achieved. South around Bastogne, the opening moves produced another pattern. German forces tried to envelop the road hub before a full American defense could form. American units arriving by truck and by road took up positions on the perimeter and called fire on approaches. Snowdrifts made shallow trenches less protective than in dry soil. Contact bursts often wasted energy beneath the surface. Proximity fuses used sparingly in the first days created airbursts over hedgerows and village streets. Battery commanders husbanded stocks for moments when companies reported an attack forming in cover just beyond the last houses. The intent was to break the last phase of the approach, the final 100 meters where attackers needed to rise and run to close with positions. When bursts appeared at man height, the final rush faltered. On the southern shoulder near Echternach, the Sauer River crossings set the tempo. German patrols probed in fog and laid boats to push companies across. American infantry fell back to higher ground and called for artillery on river flats and village edges. Here, the new Fuze met open snowfields. Observers who had struggled to pick a time setting now asked for proximity. Bursts hung over white ground and showered fragments wider than contact bursts could, because nothing smothered the detonation. Counterattacks timed to strike shallow bridgeheads used the same support with proximity airbursts to keep heads down while rifle companies advanced, throughout 16 to 19th. December, logistics dictated where and when the new Fuzes appeared. Depots issued small lots to corps. Corps pushed them to divisions where fighting was heaviest. Battery officers recorded expenditure and reported effects. In many sectors, gunners continued to fire mostly with contact and time fuses. Proximity was a supplement used at critical points. The initial notes that moved up channels emphasized 3 observations. The first was that airburst did not depend on canopy measurement, which saved time in cold conditions. The second was that fragments reached men behind low cover and in shallow snow positions. The third was that attacks paused within minutes when accurate sheaves of proximity fuses were massed on assembly areas. These observations would shape orders in the next phase. Commanders would decide where to concentrate stocks, and fire direction centers would add the new Fuze as a standard option in calls for fire. The opening moves had shown the shape of the problem. The enemy needed speed through choke points. The defense needed to thicken those points with predictable airburst. The next days would test whether that method could hold ground at the ridge at the road hub and along the river. Evening of 18th. December to morning of 19th. December set the terms at Elsenborn Ridge. The German 6th Panzer Army needed the road net that ran through crinkled Rocherath and over the ridge to Malmedy and the Meuse. American infantry and engineers backed by Corps' artillery decided to trade village streets for the high ground and make the ridge a wall. Artillery staffs at division and corps level issued 2 simple adjustments. First, prearrange concentrations along every forest ride and lateral trail where battalion-sized assault groups would have to pass. Second, when observers called for airburst, give them proximity fuses unless supply officers signaled a hard stop. That night, batteries displaced onto firmer ground behind the crest, so recoil would not sink carriages in drifted snow. Wire crews laid fresh lines and doubled routes to each forward observer. Before dawn, the gun line was ready. On 19th December, German infantry formed up under the trees east of the ridge. The plan was routine and sound. Mortars would blanket the crest. Assault platoons would cross the open belts in short rushes and then push into the next tree line with armor in support. What changed the outcome was where American shells burst. Time on target missions brought salvos from multiple battalions onto the start lines. Proximity fuses lifted the bursts above the first 5 meters of air, the space that men occupy when they leave cover and run. Fragment density rose because nothing absorbed the blast. The first rush faltered. Commanders regrouped and tried to push companies forward in bounding sections. Fire direction centers switched aim points 100 meters at a time to follow the movement, and the same pattern repeated. Within minutes, an attack that had left the woods in good order broke into small knots of men crawling or hugging ditches. By late afternoon, German units tried to feel along the northern flank, where the ground bent toward Monschau, only to meet prearranged concentrations over narrow forest lanes. The ridge held. The next day, American Corps' artillery extended that method. When scouts identified a field or a ride likely to host a new assembly, observers registered it and left deflection and quadrant data on file. When movement began, the observer reported a correction and asked for airburst. Proximity fuses removed guesswork about tree height and snow depth. Where the forest opened into a meadow, bursts still appeared at soldier height. Where the ground fell into a shallow bowl, the same height held, and fragments reached men who would have been protected from ground bursts by low folds. Tank support could not close without infantry, and without infantry, the anti-tank guns on the ridge forced armor back into the woods. By 21st December, the German attempt to pry open Elsenborn had lost tempo. At St. Vith, the contest for time became a contest for exits. German armored columns needed the crossroads to move west. American units needed to keep the road web contested long enough to bend the offensive south. Artillery played the decisive role in hours, not days. Liaison aircraft could rarely fly in the low cloud, so ground observers watched for the signature of a traffic jam engine noise in one direction. Strung headlights under a canopy flares to mark a turn. Batteries loaded proximity fuses for road cuts and village edges. When shells with air burst met soft-skinned vehicles and dismounted escorts, the result was predictable. Crews abandoned cabs and sought cover behind embankments, which slowed the column and created gaps that engineers and rearguards could exploit with demolitions. The number of destroyed vehicles mattered less than the minutes stolen from a schedule that could not spare them. Those minutes compounded into a day. Around Bastogne, the decisive action was not a single break, but a series of short stops. The German plan called for an encirclement that would tighten into capture before American reinforcements formed a stable perimeter. Artillery dictated whether the last 100 meters of each assault would be possible. When companies formed behind hedgerows or in the last tree line east or south of a village, observers inside the ring called corps artillery to add weight to division guns. Battery commanders saved proximity fuses for these calls. The effect was different from Elsenborn, but no less decisive. Air burst over the final approaches, stripped away momentum, at the moment when attackers needed to rise, charge, and crossfire swept ground. Instead, men stayed low or scattered, and the defense kept its shape. When weather lifted for short periods, aircraft added their weight, but the constant factor remained artillery that could place fragments in the air at the right height, regardless of snow. On the southern shoulder near Echternach, the Sauer River and the farm country behind it created a different geometry. German battalions made hard-won crossings that formed shallow bridgeheads on open ground. American counterattacks aimed to pinch them out before they gained depth. Proximity fuses favored the defense here because the landscape offered long white fields where contact bursts would bury and time bursts would be hard to set under stress. Observers registered the flats and the road fans beyond the river and then walked salvos forward as enemy companies tried to expand. Each time the shells burst in the air, the attack lost cohesion. Counterattacking rifle platoons could advance under their own artillery because air burst placed most fragments forward and downward onto the enemy's side of the line. By 22 December, many of the bridgeheads had been beaten back or frozen in place, and the southern flank ceased to threaten a deep penetration. Command decisions amplified these local effects. Corps headquarters issued orders that proximity fuses would be used against troop concentrations, road columns, and last 100-meter assaults, and that they would be conserved elsewhere. Supply officers created a rolling reserve by pushing small lots forward at night and keeping a buffer at corps. Fire direction centers adjusted standard fire plans so that an option for airburst appeared in every call for fire format. In practice, this meant that the observer did not have to justify the fuse each time. He only had to specify the target type and the phase of the attack. German adaptation came quickly, but could not erase the geometry of the ground. Units increased dispersion in assembly areas and used deeper foxholes when time allowed. Night attacks tried to cross the last ground under cover. Yet the snow still forced the last phase into narrow lanes, and the radio sensor in each shell still adjusted its burst to the right height over those lanes. The loss rate per minute under air burst remained higher than under contact, or poorly set time. Commanders accepted this with grim economy and shifted weight to other sectors, or waited for the weather to clear. By the last week of December, the decisive actions had generated their strategic effect. The ridge in the north stayed in American hands, which denied the best road net to the German advance. The road hub at Bastogne held, which forced a diversion of armor and time. The southern crossings failed to open a broad gate. In each place, proximity fuses did not win by spectacle. They won by removing uncertainty from the burst point of thousands of shells hour after hour, day after day. That certainty translated into minutes stolen from attacks formations, broken at the crucial distance, and a tempo that the offensive could not recover. Snow still covered the Ardennes when the immediate results became clear. By 23rd of December 1944, the German salient had lost momentum on both shoulders, and the road to the Meuse no longer looked reachable on the original schedule. American units reported that infantry assaults, which had crossed the last ground in tight waves on 16 and 17 December, were now pausing earlier and dispersing under artillery fire. The language in daily summaries stressed the same pattern across sectors. Air burst over assembly areas broke cohesion. Air burst over road cuts created short stoppages that multiplied into long delays. The effect was cumulative rather than spectacular. It translated into hours stolen from a timetable that depended on speed. The weather began to change. Skies opened in late December and allowed Allied aircraft to strike road columns during daylight. That return of air power mattered on the main supply routes behind the front. Yet the artillery story did not end when aircraft returned. Batteries had already carried the weight during the days of fog, and they continued to shape the ground fight when clouds lifted. Fire direction centers kept proximity fuses for moments, when infantry closed on positions, or when reconnaissance reported troops forming near a tree line. Commanders judged that the fuse did not replace other tools. It made barrages predictable in height, and therefore more reliable against the human targets that mattered in a winter ground assault. Logistics determined the scope of every result. Proximity fuses reached the front in controlled lots. Supply officers recorded expenditure and moved small resupply packets forward by night to reduce loss and to keep custody tight. Ammunition figures in unit journals show heavy expenditure of conventional shells through the period, with proximity fuses forming a small but decisive fraction at critical hours. The limiting factor was not only production, it was also road capacity and fuel for trucks in ice and snow. Batteries conserved the new fuse when the target did not demand it. They used contact fuses for hard targets. They used time fuses when canopy height was known. They reserved proximity fuses for troops in the open troops forming behind hedgerows, and the last 100 meters before an assault reached a village edge. German units adapted as the days passed. Infantry increased spacing in assembly areas when time allowed. Engineers dug deeper fighting positions and cut overhead cover where tools and frost permitted. Commanders shifted some attacks to night in order to reduce the effectiveness of observed fire. These measures reduced losses in specific engagements. They did not change the geometry that winter and terrain imposed. Roads still channeled movement. Tree lines still framed the last approach to every farm and hamlet. Artillery that could place bursts at soldier height could still deny the brief windows when assaults had to stand and move. Reports captured after the battle describe units that hesitated to leave deep cover during bombardment. That behavior reduced pressure at decisive minutes and gave the defenders time to reposition reserves. Casualty accounting in the Ardennes is complex, and estimates vary by sector and source. What can be stated with care is that artillery remained the largest producer of casualties in the ground battle, as it had in previous campaigns. Within that total, the proportion due to airburst increased during the weeks when proximity fuses were used against troop concentrations. This shift did not change the outcome by itself. It reinforced existing doctrine that massed fires could halt attacks when infantry and armor were forced into narrow corridors by snow and forest. The new fuse allowed that doctrine to work under conditions that defeated contact and poorly set time fuses. It turned more shells into effective airbursts and kept the tactical logic of defense intact when weather suppressed aircraft. Operational consequences followed from this tactical pattern. The Elsenborn Ridge position held and denied the best road net to the German 6th Panzer Army. The ring around Bastogne remained unbroken, while relief forces moved into place. The Echternach bridgeheads failed to expand into a corridor on the southern shoulder. Each of these outcomes had multiple causes. Fuel shortages constrained German armored thrusts. Road congestion increased maintenance losses and delayed artillery ammunition. Allied engineers blew bridges and created choke points. Yet in each place, American reports circled back to the same constant. Artillery broke the rhythm of attacks and protected the hours needed for reinforcement and counterattack. Proximity fuses made that artillery more certain in its effect on exposed troops. Command and control absorbed lessons quickly. Corps headquarters issued standing guidance that listed target categories for proximity fuses. The list prioritized road columns troops forming for attack and last-phase assault lines within clear fields of observation. Units added a simple option to call for fire formats. Observers could request airburst without further justification. Fire direction centers matched that request with the available Fuze stock and the tactical need. This administrative change reduced friction and increased the speed with which batteries could deliver the specific effect that the defense required. The shift was small on paper. It mattered in minutes when a company commander watched an assault gather behind a hedge and needed fragments above head height within the next salvo. Secrecy held through the period of greatest risk. Batteries fired proximity fuses in locations where German recovery was least likely. Shells that burst over friendly lines fragmented their own components. Shells that burst deep behind the enemy left wreckage in places difficult to access under fire. Reports of enemy capture of intact fuses during the Ardennes fighting do not appear in official summaries from the period. That outcome protected the design during the weeks when continued use could still be denied by policy if compromise occurred. The absence of compromise allowed wider employment in later winter operations and into 1945. By the first week of January 1945, the salient had begun to contract under Allied counterattacks. The offensive failed to reach Antwerp or the Meuse crossings in strength. The defenders had paid in heavy losses to hold key ground, but the line did not break where it would have caused strategic unraveling. The artillery contribution to that result was consistent and documented. Proximity fuses contributed by turning many near misses into effective airbursts during the exact minutes when infantry attacks most needed to close. The technology did not win the campaign. It prevented losses at points where contact or time fuses would have underperformed in snow and forest. The broader consequence was doctrinal. Commanders at division and corps level reported that reliable air burst against troops in the open changed their calculus on when to counterattack and how long to hold a thin line before maneuvering. They could assume that a call for fire would produce fragments in the air regardless of canopy and snow depth. That assumption allowed them to plan reserves with tighter timing and to accept risk on certain roads while massing strength elsewhere. In a battle governed by time, these modest increments of confidence added up to operational freedom. When the guns finally shifted east for new operations, the Ardennes left a clear record. Proximity fuses had amplified the strengths of an artillery system that already excelled at mass and control. They had rescued that system from the dampening effects of winter snow and inconsistent canopies. They had forced an opponent to disperse and to slow where he needed to concentrate and to rush. The immediate consequence was a stalled offensive. The near consequence was a confident defense that pivoted to counterattack. The long consequence would belong to history and would be assessed in the next part where the legacy of the Fuze and the debates around its impact move from field journals to doctrine and industry. The record that emerged from the Ardennes points to three legacies that endured beyond the snow and the pine forests. The first is technical. The proximity fuse proved that miniature radio electronics could be engineered to survive the violence of gun launch and still function with repeatable precision. Designers hardened filaments, stabilized oscillators, and sealed circuits so that a shell could make a decision in flight. That combination of ruggedization and sensing did more than improve a single round. It set a pattern for later Fuze's variable time settings and the guidance and seekers that followed in the jet and missile age. In that sense, the Fuze was not just a component. It was a gateway that brought real-time sensing into artillery and then into many other classes of weapons. The second legacy is tactical and doctrinal. Reliable air burst at soldier height rewarded armies that could mass and shift fire with speed. The United States artillery system already emphasized centralized control, flexible networks, and rapid computation of deflection and quadrant. The new Fuze multiplied the value of those habits because every salvo placed fragments where they would strike men rather than soil or snow. After the Ardennes commanders codified simple rules for when to use airburst against columns, assembly areas, and the last phase of assaults, adversaries adapted by digging deeper, increasing dispersion, and favoring night. Those adaptations, which reduced the density and speed of attacks, were victories of a kind for the defense. They constrained options and stretched time in the defender's favor. The third legacy is organizational. The path from laboratory to gun line required a tight chain that linked scientists, production engineers, inspectors, logisticians, and field units under clear authority. The program's discipline in testing secrecy and controlled fielding became a model cited in later conflicts. It showed that a narrow, solvable problem with a measurable battlefield effect could be attacked by a network of institutions if roles were defined and feedback loops were short. The lesson was not that technology alone decides a battle. It was that a well-made tool introduced into a doctrine that can exploit it shifts probabilities at the right moments. Assessment requires restraint. The proximity fuse did not stop armored divisions by itself. Terrain, weather, counterattacks, fuel shortages, and command decisions all mattered. Casualty figures by cause will always carry margins of error. What can be stated without overreach is that the fuse removed uncertainty from the burst point of thousands of shells during days when aircraft were scarce and snow smothered contact bursts. That certainty produced minutes of delay, breaks in formations, and failures of nerve at distances that decided attacks. The ridge near Elsenborn stayed in American hands. The ring around Bastogne held. The southern crossings near Ardennes did not open into a gate. The fuse was not the only reason. It was a consistent reason in each place where air burst over men mattered more than craters in snow. One sentence, conclusion, and call to action. The proximity fuse turned near misses into reliable air bursts, and in doing so altered tactics and timelines. At the Battle of the Bulge, explore the reading list to judge its weight for yourself.